Hello, everybody, and welcome back to another episode of When Life Gives You Melons. I'm Sydney, your host, and today we have a special guest, Dr. Drag. Dr. Drag is a neuropsychologist and an assistant professor at Stanford. So, welcome, Dr. Drag.
Thank you.
Would you like to tell us a little bit about yourself, your training, what you do?
Sure. So I am a clinical neuropsychologist, which means that I do assessments of cognitive functioning. And that can include a wide range of things from learning disabilities to ADHD to dementia. As you mentioned, I am a neuropsychologist and a clinical assistant professor at Stanford in the Department of Neurology and Neurological Sciences. I also have my private practice in San Jose, where I do a lot of these types of evaluations. I did my undergraduate at Pomona College down in Southern California. I earned my doctoral degree in clinical psychology from the University of Arizona. And then I did my postdoctoral training at the University of Michigan before moving back out to California and eventually joining Stanford and starting my private practice where I'm at now.
Wow, great. Thank you so much for telling us about yourself. Obviously, we have a very knowledgeable guest today who will be telling us a little bit more about the background of what dyslexia is and how we can diagnose it. So, given that, let's jump right in. Can you tell us first what causes dyslexia?
So, dyslexia is a neurological condition. There are clear changes to the brain that cause the symptoms of dyslexia. This is not simply someone being slow to learn to read. This is not a fifth grader that is just slow and performing at a third grade level. Research has shown that even when individuals with dyslexia are compared to younger individuals at the same reading level. So say a fifth grader being compared to a third grader at the same reading level, their brains are functioning differently. So there are clear changes to the brain. It's not something that's typically outgrown, but certainly individuals can learn to build skills and compensate and really reduce the impact of the dyslexia on their functioning. There's a lot of research to show that it's genetically based in some part. Dyslexia does tend to run in the family. It's not an issue of IQ. It's not low IQ. It's not attention or anything like that. It is a specific reading-based disorder that is due to changes in the way the brain works in individuals with dyslexia.
So, you talked a little bit about how it's not effort based and you can find ways to work around it. So, what are dyslexic strengths and weaknesses when it comes to that?
So there's a lot of strengths that individuals with dyslexia have. Well, we typically think of dyslexia as specific to reading, and it is. It is a reading-based disorder, but there's a lot of other strengths and weaknesses that accompany it that many people don't realize. And we'll talk about some of the weaknesses maybe in a bit, but I do want to focus on one of the things you asked is the strengths. Um, so individuals with dyslexia tend to see the bigger picture. They tend to see the forest, maybe missing the trees, um, but they tend to view things holistically. So if you think about kind of attention as a spotlight, when you're reading, it helps to have a very small focused spotlight and you read, and then when you're done with that paragraph, you move on to the next one. Individuals with dyslexia tend to have a much wider spotlight, and that can cause problems with things like reading because being able to pay attention to a lot of things all at once can be detrimental when you're trying to read. But that's actually a strength in a lot of other ways. There's research that has shown that individuals with dyslexia are very good at processing things as a whole because they're seeing the bigger picture. Their spotlight is just wider. They are good at identifying visual anomalies. So if they look at a pattern, they're going to be the ones that spot the weed amongst the flowers, because instead of having just a very narrow focused spotlight searching an environment, they're processing everything at once. And so that can certainly cause some problems, but I think it also can really be seen as a strength for individuals. What an interesting study had shown that individuals with dyslexia in a room, when they're hearing multiple voices, like at a cocktail party, individuals with dyslexia can actually pick out more words spoken by other people all around them than individuals And that's actually that skill is linked to reading proficiency, which is, I think, is something no one would really expect, but makes sense when you think about how the brains of individuals with dyslexia work. This is why you see dyslexia being common amongst entrepreneurs. Seeing the bigger picture, seeing things differently. That's why this is a strength. Recognizing patterns, being creative, thinking outside the box, reasoning. These are all strengths that individuals with dyslexia have, which can lead them to be extremely successful in life.
Yeah, so some people call dyslexia actually their superpower. So do you think that that might be the reason?
Certainly, certainly. The brain is different and it processes information in different ways. And unfortunately, when you have to read, that can cause problems. But as I mentioned, there's a lot of strengths that come with it that people can really grasp and use it to their advantage. And I think you have a lot of very well-known, high-functioning, successful individuals that also happen to have a history of dyslexia.
Wow, that's really great to hear. So, moving to the more diagnosis side of things, can you tell us what are the four types of dyslexia and how do we usually spot them out?
Yeah, so there's different subtypes of dyslexia, and it's not that one person has one type versus another, but they're just four different areas where individuals can have weaknesses. So the first is phonological processing. So that means translating letters to sound. So understanding the phonemes of speech. So the word bat is made up of the phonemes b, a, t, and understanding those sounds go together, and a B and an A and a T make those sounds. So individuals who have difficulty with phonological processing, and that's a core symptom of dyslexia, have difficulty sounding out words when they're given non-words, so made up words, they still have trouble sounding it out. This can impact things like rhyming. This can impact, obviously, as you can imagine, spelling. Someone having difficulty understanding what letters go with what sound, they're not going to be able to spell. It's going to impact their spelling. The other type of dyslexia that you can see is called a surface dyslexia. So this is more sight word, and this is actually a different part of the brain. It's sight word reading. So if you think back in school, a lot of younger students learn how to read words based on just recognizing what they look like. The word should, should, you don't really pronounce the L, it's should. And so it's knowing what words look like and associating it with what they sound like. And so this can come up as problems, irregular words. So an individual with having difficulties with this, they look at the word yacht and they don't remember, or they can't connect that yacht is not yakta, it's yacht. And so it's the look of a word compared to the sound of it. So individuals might be okay sounding out words that sound exactly like they should, but have difficulty with more of these irregular words, bouquet, subtle, things like that. Another area where individuals can have difficulties is with rapid naming. So it's called rapid automatic naming. And essentially that's word retrieval. So being able to quickly come up with words. And it's not a function of vocabulary knowledge or lack of familiarity with the word. It's being able to come up with it and produce it rapidly on the spot. So oftentimes you see individuals perhaps talk around a word. They use circumlocution. So, can you hand me the thing over there? The thing that I put the papers together with. I clip the papers together when they really want the word stapler. Or they can describe it but not name it. And so really this is more of a speed thing, the word rapid. It's not ability or knowledge, but it's speed. The ability to fluently come up with the names of words. And this has been linked to reading fluency. And then the fourth type that people often talk about is actually called the double deficit. It's when people have difficulties with both the phonological processing as well as the rapid naming. And so those two together cause what's called a double deficit, meaning that there's difficulties across multiple areas that interact and compound the difficulties that an individual's having.
Wow. I didn't know many of those. So, when somebody comes in and they think they have dyslexia, or their parents think that they might have dyslexia, or a teacher, makes sense notes home, you might want to get tested. What is the first thing that you're looking for, and what tests might you give them?
Yeah, so there's a lot to look for. So when someone comes in, or a parent has concerns and my child just seems to have difficulty with reading, that can mean a lot of different things, and it doesn't necessarily mean dyslexia. Dyslexia is a very specific type of reading problem. And there are other reasons that reading can be impacted. So someone could have a problem with reading comprehension that might not be due to dyslexia. Dyslexia, as I talked about, is the phonological processing. Someone actually might have good phonological processing, but for whatever reason has problems comprehending what they're reading. That's something separate. So what I'm looking for is, okay, if there is a reading issue, what is it due to? Is it due to these same issues I talked about with dyslexia, or is it due to something else? Is it just solely reading speed? Is it reading comprehension? Is it vision? There's a lot of non-reading related reasons that someone could have slow reading. I mentioned speed. Maybe they have slow processing speed across the board. And it's just really highlighted with reading because it's a really effortful, challenging task. But if we actually test them, they're slow to process all sorts of different types of tasks. Maybe it's an attention issue, and that's something to consider. Um, a lot of kids with attention issues also struggle with reading because reading is significantly attention dependent. I mentioned visual processing. Maybe this is a visual issue where they're having difficulty scanning and reading the small print. Could be memory. If someone has a weak memory, they're going to have difficulty remembering what they read 3 sentences ago and then being able to synthesize and comprehend. So as a neuropsychologist, one of my roles or my task is to really dig deeper beyond, okay, is this dyslexia or not, but what's really underlying the difficulties this individual is having. And there's a lot of things to consider. Like we said, attention, learning and memory, processing speed, reading comprehension, and things like that. So as a neuropsychologist, I gather a lot of different information. There's formal tests that we do to look at all these different aspects of reading, of speech, of language. I mentioned spelling can be affected, vocabulary knowledge. But when someone comes in, I don't want to just say, oh, you have a reading issue. Let me just test your reading. We'll see if it's high or low. And that's the end of it. It's important to get a really comprehensive view of the individual because maybe there's multiple things that are low or multiple things that are high. And so I want to get a sense of strengths and weaknesses across all these different areas so that I really understand how this individual's brain is working, why it might be causing problems, and then identifying different treatments and skills and strategies that they can use based on their own strengths and weaknesses.
Interesting. So before we get to, treatments, are there any unusual symptoms that people with dyslexia sometimes get? I mean, I've heard about, being slow to process left and right. Is there anything that you've noticed over the years?
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of people think of dyslexia as, oh, I confuse my 6 and my 9s and my B's and my D's, and certainly that occurs. That's can accompany dyslexia. That is also developmentally appropriate up to a certain age. You have a lot of younger children who do those very same things until they start to really learn their letters and such. I think it's important to realize that dyslexia is so much more than just that. As I mentioned, it affects spelling. It also affects vocabulary knowledge because individuals who are having difficulty reading may tend to avoid it, and therefore they might not grow their vocabulary knowledge because they're not reading as much. And then both of those affects someone's writing. If an individual doesn't have a great vocabulary, or if they can't come up with words, we talked about the rapid automatic naming issue, or if they can't spell the words, they're not going to use those words. And so their writing can be affected. You may see people mispronouncing words. So someone means to say specific, but they say Pacific because the sequencing of the sounds gets mixed up. They might confuse similar words. They might say human instead of humid. Mispronouncing words when reading out loud, they might add a sound or omit a sound. So there's so much more to dyslexia than just I confuse my B's and D's. That's primarily kind of language and reading based. Beyond that, there's evidence that dyslexia can affect other things. So individuals with dyslexia tend to have weaknesses in visual attention. And we kind of already talked about that, how they see the forest, but maybe miss the trees. Also working memory. So that's the ability to hold information in mind and manipulate it. So things like calculating a tip at a restaurant would be working memory. So individuals with dyslexia often have verbal working memory weaknesses. And it's kind of hard to say whether it's a cause, a contributing factor to this dyslexia, or a consequence. So, if someone has working memory problems, that can impact their reading. Obviously, they're not going to be able to remember what they read just a couple minutes ago. It can also, dyslexia can affect working memory in that a lot of working memory is rehearsal. So if someone is slow to articulate their thoughts and the words in their head, they're not going to be able to rehearse the information in mind, and they're more prone to forgetting it. So, I think those are some areas of cognitive weaknesses that people might not expect to see, but can certainly occur in individuals with dyslexia. I think another thing to consider, and it's important to be aware of, is that dyslexia commonly co-occurs with a lot of different disorders. So ADHD, math disorders, speech disorders, they all occur at higher rates in conjunction with dyslexia than individuals without dyslexia. And so just because someone has dyslexia doesn't mean they can't also have ADHD as well. And then you have another bit of a double whammy, because then there's multiple areas that need to be addressed. It's also common for individuals to have higher risks of mental health issues, academic underperformance, decreased enrollment in higher education, meaning they're not going as far in school or college, occupational underperformance. So, I think some people might think of dyslexia as just a reading issue, not a big deal, it's just reading. Well, one, reading impacts a lot of different things. And then hopefully, as I've kind of illustrated, dyslexia is more than just reading. It affects a lot of different areas of individuals functioning.
Yeah, that's really good for people to know. I mean, it's not just one thing that's affected. It could be, many things that affect all parts of your life.
Right.
So there are a lot of people who haven't been diagnosed with dyslexia until maybe they're 50 or 60. And you talked about how when you're younger, sometimes flipping letters or numbers or being confused is part of growing up. So when do you think the best age is to really decide if somebody has dyslexia, or if somebody wants to get tested, what's the best time to go in?
Well, I think it's as soon as you realize there's an issue. So I think there's kind of an old, outdated heuristic that, well, you really can't diagnose dyslexia before age 7, because that's right around when people should not be flipping their numbers. I have a 5-year-old at home. She flips her B's and D's all the time. Her teacher's obviously not concerned, but maybe if she was doing that in the 3rd grade, she would be. But that rule of thumb, I think, is a little outdated, in that we can start to diagnose these reading problems and dyslexia earlier on. There are indicators that we can see on formal testing, even at a young age, that someone is not performing at expected levels in these areas. And the earlier the intervention, the better. Starting to build those skills at an earlier age is better. So I would say as soon as there's an inkling that there's an issue, because even if it's not dyslexia, you want to figure out what it is and how it can be addressed. And the earlier the intervention, the better. That's not to say that someone at age 50 can't be diagnosed. A lot of times people are able to compensate. They can hide it well. They can figure out workarounds. And so it might not be until they take a job where it's really reading dependent that it really becomes an issue, or it's really noticeable, or they really think, what, something isn't right. And so whatever age that is, that's an appropriate age to be assessed.
Oh, good to know. So, anytime's a good time to go in and figure all this out. California recently passed a ballot measure that would allow for more funding towards screening for dyslexia in elementary and middle school students. So could you give us kind of a look at what this screening might be like and what these tests might entail?
Certainly. And I think this is fantastic, because it shows that California is recognizing the need to intervene early, to identify students who have these challenges and provide them with the appropriate support. So if someone were to go through a screening or testing for dyslexia, at the very minimum, it's going to focus on some of these areas that we talked about. One would be phonological processing. So that would be, for example, having a student read words out loud and having them sound these words out with both real words and non-words. So a word they've never seen before and is nonsensical, but can they sound out each of the phonemes and produce the right sounds? Another aspect of this is we talked about a sight word reading. So having them read irregular words, because do they know, is the part of their brain that is responsible for visual word forms, are they able to look at a word and identify and recognize that word and be able to know what sounds go with it? That's the yacht and the subtle type of words. And then more higher level reading. So reading fluency, how quickly and accurately they can read. Reading comprehension, having an individual read a paragraph and respond to it or respond to multiple choice questions. Spelling would also be an important piece of this. Going back to both words and non-words, do they understand how to translate sound now into letters? And then if there is more comprehensive testing, I think that would kind of screen for identifying a reading problem. As I mentioned before, more comprehensive testing is usually done to look at intellectual functioning, processing speed and attention, working memory, as I mentioned, learning and memory, things like that, to really identify other areas of strengths and weaknesses, and rule out any other possible additional diagnoses as well.
Once somebody gets their dyslexia diagnosis, so say somebody got a screening and it came back and they might need to see a neuropsychologist, and then they get the news that they do have dyslexia. How do you move on from there? How do you try and fix some of these deficiencies and make it so that you can succeed in school and move forward professionally?
Yeah, so as I've mentioned before, it's clearly not an effort issue. It's not an IQ issue. It's not an effort issue. It's not someone just not trying hard enough. It's also not an exposure issue. It's not just, oh, well, I never really read growing up, so I've never been great at reading because I just didn't read very much. It's not exposure or limited education. Yeah, I didn't pay attention in school. It's truly a neurological condition. So it's not that someone can fix it just by reading more. I mean, that does help. More exposure helps, but that's not going to be the fix. Or just trying harder or working harder. As a neuropsychologist, I try and help people work smarter, not necessarily harder. And so once someone has been identified as having this type of reading issue, it's working with an individual with specific training in these types of approaches. It could be an educational therapist, an educational psychologist. The schools have school psychologists and other sorts of specialized individuals who can help build some of these skills and work on them. And a lot of it is identifying compensatory strategies, learning different ways to go about and tackling reading. But I think, one of the first things that I do when I talk to clients is really emphasizing that this is not an IQ thing. This is not them not trying hard or being stupid. And I think that's what a lot of people feel. They feel like they are not good readers. It's hard for them. It affects all different areas of their life, and that can really impact self-confidence. And so I really try and emphasize individuals' strengths, all the areas that they're doing well in, and try to explain this is why you're having the difficulty. And having that explanation, I think, goes a long way for a lot of people. And then giving them targeted recommendations for treatment to give them optimism that, yeah, even though you're age 50 and this is the first time you've sought help, there is help out there and you can improve.
Yeah, I would totally agree. I've heard so many people, say, oh, I think I'm not trying hard enough, or I think I'm stupid,
Yeah.
but it's really not something that they can control. I mean, like as a kid, I would keep a spelling notebook and try to write down like words like hundreds of times, and it just, 101st time you still spell it wrong. And so it's really good to hear that it's not a effort-based or intelligence-based issue.
And I think unfortunately, when these struggles go unidentified, people start to feel that way, or they get labeled as lazy, or you hear them not living up to potential a lot. And I think that's really unfortunate, because then these kids start to hear the message that it's something that they're doing wrong, or they're not trying hard enough. And that's where the mental health issues comes in, and that's where the self-confidence and the sense of self-efficacy, that if I put my mind to it, I can do it. And sometimes with dyslexia, there's barriers to that. They don't realize it, so they just feel like, well, I must not be trying hard enough.
Right. So if you were to give advice to parents who are starting to see that, or kids who are starting to feel that, what would you say?
Well, I really would encourage parents to look at the holistic picture of the child, and realize that there's clearly a weakness in a certain area that can be addressed. As I mentioned, there's people with dyslexia go on to do amazing things. As you mentioned, it can be a superpower, certainly. And I think really just reminding their kids that there are strengths and weaknesses. We all have them. And for them, their weakness is reading. Um, for me, my weakness is wayfinding. I cannot find my way out of a paper bag. We all have this. And that's what makes each of us unique and special. And so I think really explaining that and educating parents and children about that this is a brain disorder, and it's one part of the brain, it's one part of who you are, but there's so many other parts to you, and this should not hold you back.
I like that a lot.
Thank you for having me.
Great. Thank you so much for being here, everyone. Dr. Drag, I'll link all of her information below. If you guys have any questions, we will try to have them answered. And once again, thank you so much, Dr. Drag, for being here.
You're very welcome.